that we started out with, Amatullah also said that that she can relate to the second definition, the revised understanding of culture. So, Amatullah, how and why do you relate to or find the second understanding of culture convincing? What is the reason behind that?
So, because I feel that it is way more inclusive,
Okay.
uh, and when we so when we actually go with the newest form of culture, we see that uh, I forgot the term, but what do we say? We are we believe in giving benefit of doubt to the other person, and I think that that is why I would go
Uh,
with it.
First, very important point that you have brought up. This is for all of you. This is not new culture, right? This is a new understanding or new idea of culture. That
Idea.
culture is related to the political and economic domains. It includes the logics of caste, class, gender, and profit, and so on and so forth, right? So this idea of culture is the new idea of culture. It does not mean that today's culture is more inclusive. Amatullah, I hope you get the distinction here. We are
Yes,
not
sir.
talking
Yes,
about
sir.
today's culture. We are
Yes,
talking
sir.
of today's theory of culture,
Idea of culture. Yes.
or a theory of culture, right? So I
Yeah.
ask you, which theory of culture can you relate to more? The first traditional idea of culture, or this modern theory of culture?
Uh, Sir, I think the modern idea of culture more.
Why?
Um, so again, can we not say that because this? I mean, the modern idea of culture is way more inclusive than the traditional idea of culture.
Yes, it is. It is. The modern or the revised understanding of culture that you find in culture studies, right? And this is not what everybody follows, Amatullah. This is the academic discipline of culture studies follows this idea of culture. I hope you get it. It's not actually people following this idea, right?
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
It's not to be found in the society around us. It is it is the lens with which we analyze culture, right? It is the new way of looking at culture, new way of approaching culture, not the culture itself. I
Okay.
hope you
Okay.
get it. And as you
Yeah.
rightly said, it is definitely inclusive. It's more definitely. And why do you say it is inclusive idea of culture?
Sir, because when we actually view things from the lens of the traditional idea of culture, we see that like nobody is perfect. Everybody has their own set of flaws or problems that they go through. So when we are biased enough to give ourselves the benefit of doubt, we okay, we have this problem, why don't we give that same benefit of doubt to the other person?
Can you be more specific in what relation are you talking about flaws and benefit of doubts? One specific
um,
instance. And what do you mean by benefit of doubt?
So there are many, but as of now, I don't know why I'm just completely blank. There are many. I can
Okay,
come up.
doesn't matter. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
you can take your time to reflect over it, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, Manjari, Khushi, anything to say? Which theory of culture you find more interesting or correct?
So I cannot really say that what I find interesting, but then I have
Hmm.
an observation to make as far as culture is
Yeah, yeah,
concerned,
please,
and
please do.
especially yeah, and especially if we look at culture today, it is kind of too homogeneous. If you take like a very banal example to be taken, can be clothes. So if you look at
Ah,
everybody is
ah,
wearing the same pants and the same shirts. So
right.
when I look at it and reflect about it, what I feel is 30 years down the line or some 10, 20 years later, everybody would start looking the same with those spiked hair and or straight hair or curly hair for that matter, and then we won't have distinctions as we had earlier. So those distinctions that made people different. And when we were discussing about probably Mahabharata, and you gave that example of Karna and the Sutputra thing. So also another observation that I felt was that this was a part of the later Vedic age. If we look at it chronologically, and earlier, as I don't know that that's also a theory, but then in the probably during the earlier Vedic age, things were much different, and that is what a lot of people point out too. That if you look at the earlier Vedic age when it came, so everything starts getting corrupted eventually because people start finding loopholes, and that's how things work. That when something gets old, it's you kind of know it all around it, and then you can pinpoint and adjust it to your needs, and that's how a society grows and develops. So probably that is also something that led to a culture of its times, and that is how a civilization grows and then it declines. So probably it was a declining phase, and then another civilization would come up, and that's how things start.
And I agree with both your observations, very good observations, I should say. One is that the contemporary culture seems to getting more homogenized, right? And second observation was that the Mahabharata depiction of Varna Jati is a later development compared to the Vedic understanding of Varna, right? Did I understand these two observations
Yes.
properly?
And
Yeah.
the second, yeah, and the second observation that I made is actually not mine, but then I kind of read it when I was reading A.L. Basham's A Wonder That Was India. And also, there's this one text by Vincent Arthur Smith. So it's on the history of India. So it has like, it is from a colonialist perspective. So that is how they were kind of reflecting on it, showing that we are all snake charmers, and that is how we are considered when you go to the West. So that entire thing kind of made me to come
What
back
is the
to this
colonial
conclusion.
idea you mean? Can you repeat?
So that the colonialist idea of Indians being snake charmers and not doing any developments as far as anything is concerned. So that was something that I could come through while I was reading Vincent Arthur Smith. So that brought me to this conclusion that the way Indians are portrayed outside is very different from what we are actually, or how things are happening. So it's like that entire thing of Orientalism that comes into play when
Right.
we're
Let's
discussing
take
that.
these both two examples because I find them very good observations. What I am pointing out is not what culture actually is, right? I am talking of two ways of analyzing the observation or phenomena that you just mentioned. One is the traditional one, which says that culture is spiritual, ahistorical, not connected to the material domain. It is a superior kind of domain to material domain. It is superior, right? It is higher form of being. That is what the traditional idea of culture is. The second idea of culture, which is given to us by culture studies, right, says that culture cannot be separated from material, historic, economical forces. And the logic of culture is very often driven by politics of all kinds. That's the second way of understanding culture, right? So coming back to your phenomena that you mentioned, the first phenomena you say is the growing homogenization in terms of passion, for example, right? Am I right, Manjari?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yes, sir.
the first. Now, how will you look at it? Will you prefer to look at this from the traditional understanding of culture or a historicist understanding of culture? Which will you prefer?
So I think both of these lenses have their own advantages and disadvantages. So probably I would like to
So,
use
what is
both
the
the lenses
advantage
to.
of traditional view of culture regarding the first phenomena that you observed of growing homogenization in fashion? How would a traditional culture, uh, student of a traditional approach to culture, what will that give us? What will that help us to discover?
So I think probably when you look at culture in its traditional sense, and if you look at its definition, it precisely deals with appearances and how something gets created as a result of society, and the outcome of it is when people start living at a place, and probably that's how, and whatever they develop over the course of years forms a part of their culture. Like for example, using mud pots for filling water and not using copper vessels, or probably so that's how culture develops. Like for example, Chalcolithic cultures developed around copper, or for that matter,
But that
Bronze
is a
Age
historical
civilizations developed.
understanding or traditional understanding of culture. What you are telling me.
So I think it's both, because it's historical, because you're using the timeline and that cannot be evaded at any point in time. And then it's traditional because that's a part of their tradition, and tradition means something that is passed on from generation to generation. And when you talk of generations, you talk of time, so you're anyways talking of history there.
राइट, बट व्हाट आई एम सेइंग, जिसे आप ट्रेडिशन कहते हो, राइट, उसको देखने के दो नजरिए। एक है जो वो कहता है कि ट्रेडिशन इज समथिंग स्पिरिचुअल, हायर फॉर्म ऑफ बीइंग, not connected to material politics or history. That is the first way of looking at culture, like Matthew Arnold did, and like F.R. Lewis did. That culture is something to be inculcated, and that will make you a higher form of, more holistic form of human being. Right? It is something that you cultivate, and the word cultivate has something to do with culture. So it has to do with inner cultivation. Right? So this traditional idea of culture, right, will tell you that these pots that you're talking about are products of great spiritual value. They have religious significance or whatever, higher form of significance. While the other approach will say that it is governed by material necessities of the time, historical necessities of the time, and uh, maybe there is a politics to it, right? So there are two ways of looking at the same phenomena. That is what I'm telling you. So which is more accurate in your view, the first one or the second one?
Yeah, so I think for me it will depend on the situation. So probably when you look at this example, the second one, the latter one looks better because it kind of has that backing or reasoning to it. And then
Okay, so
if you look
come
at
back.
that
Yeah, yeah.
culture,
So come back to homogenization of fashion, and
okay,
which
so if we
attitude?
look at,
Hmm.
so then we could put it through, probably we could put it through globalization as a theory. So when everything starts, when you start living in a global village, obviously there's a lot of
So when you
interconnectedness.
are taking this globalization as a context, which approach are you using to culture? Traditional or the new,
Contempt.
the culture studies idea of culture, or Matthew Arnold idea of culture?
I think so. The culture studies idea of culture, which is the new one, probably.
And
That's one.
do you think that it will help you to understand it better?
Yes, sir. Because I think there are two reasons to it that come to my mind when I say that it will help me understand this one better. First, it is the time frame that it is the time frame when you look at Arnold's this thing. It is more connected to not the material world, and the example is of the material world. So I think it makes it. These are two distinct things when we discuss when we kind of put them together, so they cannot be put through in the same vessel. And the second thing is
No, no,
the
that's what
second
I
thing
am
that
saying, that these are two different approaches. Which one do you find more relatable? ऐसा मैं पूछ रहा हूँ.
So जो नया वाला है, the new criticism thing, I
हाँ,
find
तो
that
वही मैं
more
कह रहा हूँ. हाँ, हाँ. So when you look at the second example, where you say that Vedic culture was the highly emancipated, glorious period where everybody was equal, and then slowly jati, where varna was actually based on people's guna and karma, and slowly it started declining, and jati system seems to be on emergence, and that you find in Mahabharata. Which approach are you taking, the first one or the second one?
so in that case, I think there's this I'm not sure of which approach am I taking, but then probably I feel that there's this idealist stand that everybody wants to put through when there's any situation. So in order to counter the fact that this has not happened, you always bring something. Like for example, when I remember that we had this, I think we had a lecture for history, and probably somebody pointed out, I think the professor only pointed out that for example, if we talk of women emancipation, so we mentioned Gargi and Maitri, and that's how we put forth this entire discourse of a kind of trying to legitimize what has happened. So probably that is the kind of stand that anybody takes when they talk of early Vedic period, and they try to kind of try to legitimize their entire thing. And
So which attitude
also,
that will be? That legitimization and creation of idea of Vedic age as the golden period where women were emancipated, had same freedom as men. This perception is Matthew Arnold's perception, or will you call it culture studies perception?
so I think if I am able to understand it correctly, if you look at Matthew Arnold's this thing, it is not connected to the material world anyways, and all of these ideas that we are discussing are a part of the material world. So obviously I think I should go with culture studies and not Matthew
No, no,
Arnold.
but when you say that somebody pointed out, right, that the Vedic period was the period of golden age for women because of Gargi and others, and later on it deteriorated, right? This narrative
Right.
is, comes from where? It comes from the idealist, a historist understanding of culture, or does it come from uh, culture studies way of looking at culture?
So I think it's culture studies way of culture and not an
Does
ahistorics
culture
narrative
studies
because it has.
does culture studies argue that कल्चर वो एक जमाने में बहुत प्योर और हायर फॉर्म का था और बाद में वो डिटेरियोरेट हो गया, ऐसे कल्चर स्टडीज कहेगा?
ये
When you say
so I'm
culture
not too
can
sure.
never be safe, when you say culture can, there is a very interesting point. This is a very interesting discussion, Manjari. I think you brought up very interesting observation. Culture studies says that culture can never be separated from political, historical, and economic concerns, preoccupations. तो एक
Right.
जमाने में ये नहीं थे और बाद में आए, ये नैरेटिव एक्सेप्ट करेगा कल्चर स्टडीज?
नहीं नहीं करेगा
नहीं करेगा ना?
because it's ever evolving, तो वो नहीं करेगा.
Yeah, so at all times, culture would always be related to the economic, political, and historical dimensions. You cannot separate culture from economic, political, and cultural dimensions. So even the purest understanding of past, which believes that Vedic culture was all good, right, overlooks that even Vedic culture would have political, historical, and economic dimensions to it,
Facet.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So this new understanding of culture is the foundational point of culture studies. Anyone has to say something about this very interesting conversation that Manjari brought up? खुशी, अमातुला, तत्सम, ये कॉन्वर्जेशन के बारे में कुछ कहना है आपको? उससे आप क्या समझे? खुशी, अमातुला, तत्सम.
So, sir, can we say like that the traditional historicism is like a linear representation?
Traditional historicism is like linear, yes.
Represent.
जैसे कि पहले सुवर्ण युग था और बाद में सब खराब हो गया. That is the
It's a like
traditional way of looking at the past, right? या हमारे जमाने में तो 25 पैसे में घी मिलता था.
and now it's like like
So that is the
it's series.
traditional way of looking at the past. You are right. You can say that.
And like our new historicism is not linear. It's like we interpret and we analyze everything from history.
Yes. Yes. Correct. You can say that. Khushi Amatullah, what do you have to say?
Sir, I don't think I have anything to add or say.
But what did you get from these conversations that we had? Anything that you found interesting in the conversation?
Yeah, the entire homogeneous part that Manjari brought up, I think that was
Right.
something
The
new.
growing homogenization
Yeah.
of culture has an economic and political dimension of globalization and neoliberal economy and technology, right? So why does a person in, say, for example, Randir, start imitating the lifestyle of New York? Right, wear same similar clothes or wear same hair fashion of hairdo or clothes, is because the technology has introduced him to these new models of fashion which you are trying to, and then by doing that you are trying to prove that you are up to date and modern, right? अगर आप वेस्ट की फैशन कॉपी करते हो तो आप अप टू डेट और मॉडर्न होते हो, और जो नहीं करते वो बैकवर्ड होते हैं. So that gives you a kind of perceptual advantage of being modern and contemporary while the traditional ones are backward. Would you agree to this logic, cultural logic of fashion, Manjari?
I think yes, I would agree to this cultural logic
Right.
of fashion.
So when you look at this logic of, which is political, right? You are saying you are superior and progress because you wear the latest fashion, uh, and the others who don't follow it are backward. It is the logic of capitalism who wants to sell you that goods. हाँ ना.
Yes, sir.
तो
Probably,
उनको
I think,
उनको
sir, if
प्रॉफिट मिलेगा ना ये नया ऋण बेच के.
absolutely, sir. I think I can put it through an example. Probably, if we look at US as a soft power and the hegemony that it displays, even even like a very simple example of McDonald's as a food chain, and people having McDonald's and it being customized according to the countries. Like for example, India has aloo tikki so that it appeals to the Indian taste buds, and then Japan has, for example, Japan, I think it has sushi in the burgers or something else. So probably that's how they try to customize it
Very
to
good.
sell off their
इसे
products.
glocalization कहते हैं. Glocalization means you create products for specific markets. So you will have vegetarian burger, which is unimaginable, or vegetable hot dog, uh, which is unimaginable in New York, right?
Yes, sir.
जैन सॉसेज मैंने अभी तक नहीं खाया है. मैं राह देख रहा हूँ कब आएगा मार्केट में. आएगा एक दिन.
ऐसा भी
जैन
कुछ होता
So
है.
this
Can
is Jain.
sausages be?
जैन सॉसेज आएगा
It's
तब हम
like the
खाएंगे.
Jain egg.
हाँ, एक
It's
दिन
like the
आएगा.
Jain egg a lot of people
एग,
eat.
हाँ हाँ, बिल्कुल बिल्कुल. So if Jain egg comes, can Jain sausage be far behind? Okay, on that note, let us turn towards our fields that we are looking at. So this revised understanding of category of culture, right, as an analytical category, not as what culture is, but how you study it. So the way you studied culture changed, right? And this gave rise to something called culture studies, and it began very prominently in Britain with uh, people like Raymond Williams and Richard Hogarth, where they based themselves in the University of Birmingham. So Birmingham School of Culture Studies looks at culture as a political category, as an economic category, and looks for this political logics which are embedded in our cultural values. Right. So from that point of view, they started interrogating literature as an elite canonical formation, which F.R. Lewis and Matthew Arnold were talking about. And they pointed out that Matthew Arnold was trying to establish his own hegemonic uh, of his own class over the working class. Right. And in the process, they imposed a kind of high culture and rejected and marginalized the popular culture, the culture of the working class, right? And so in the revised understanding of culture, the high culture is being challenged, right? And yes, you look at even the culture of working class, culture of poor people, culture of marginal sections of society, the migrants, the laborers, and so on and so forth, right? So culture studies try to displace the canonical understanding of literature. That is one very important move of culture studies. You question this canonical elitist notion of culture and arts, and you bring in whatever was marginalized. So literature is studied along with other cultural signifying practices, as they call it, like fashion, like food, like comic books, like pornographic books that were sold cheaply on the streets, and so on and so forth, right? So idea that you study a great literary canon was challenged, and literature was now situated within the cultural politics of that society. That is the first important move of culture studies. And another important inspiration comes from Roland Barthes. His book called Mythologies in 1957 analyzes using semiotics, fashion detergent advertisement, WWF wrestling, uh, and images and photographs and advertisements and pamphlets, uh, uh, TV serials, and all those things, right? So Roland Barthes also in France introduces different way of looking at culture. Culture as a meaning-making practice or a semiotic system, right? Which is embedded in the cultural politics, right? And what he calls mythology is for him a second order of semiotic system. That means one thing is given another meaning in another system. And he analyzes a photograph of a black man saluting the French flag. So it is supposed to promote the idea that France is an inclusive nation, right? But what he does, that it hides an idea that the blacks were excluded from understanding of French nationalism. So French nationalist understanding of culture excluded blacks. So that photograph tries to promote the opposite of the reality, cultural reality, right? And that is what he calls the mythologies, right? Say, for example, washing clothes with detergent is a chore, right? It's a headache, but you show it as a very enjoyable activity. And that's how he defines myth as a depoliticized speech. So for Barth, advertisements, TV series, reality shows, wrestling matches, cricket matches, all these are mythologies or depoliticization of cultural realities. They conceal the fact of oppression and exploitation. So that is a very important influence on culture studies coming from Roland Barthes, right? And the third comes from Frankfurt School of uh, Culture Studies, or you can say that, which combines Marxism and Freudianism in Germany. And you have people like Walter Benjamin, who also focuses on technology and industrial change and the status of art that is changing. And then Habermas, whom we discussed, right? Adorno and Horkheimer. So all these new thinkers after World War revised the understanding of culture. And many of them were coming from Marxist, Freudian perspectives, giving rise to culture studies, right? So along with this is post-structuralist development in France, where three important names influence culture studies. One is Louis Althusser, right, a Marxist structuralist who argued that culture is an ideological state apparatus. That means culture is hegemonic in Gramscian sense of word. It is meant to convince the exploited and the oppressed that all is right with the world, and this is the condition that which should be there. It is status quoism that ideological state apparatus promotes, and some of the most important examples of ideological state apparatus is education system, media, TV, magazines, journals, films, religion, and so on and so forth. Right? Yeah, Tatsam.
So could you please explain? Could you please explain this again?
Ideological state apparatus.
Yes, sir.
So Althusser says that in a society there are two ways by which a dominant class controls the working class. One is through repressive apparatus, that is the police and army and danda, right? The stick. And the other is ideological state apparatus, which is all about hegemony, convincing people, persuading people without using force. And ideological state apparatus involves things like education, religion, cinema, TV, media, ye wo. And the job of culture basically is ideological state apparatus. And he says ideology, right, is not false consciousness, like Marx said, but it is a system in which man is, or human subject is interpellated. By interpellation means you are labeled, you are hailed as something. So when a child is born, people say, oh, this is a girl. So that place of that small baby is fixed in the cultural system of values. So she should wear these clothes, she should behave in this way, she should do these. Her roles are determined even before she is born, right? What should she study? Why should she study? What kind of future she should have? All that is predetermined. You are
At
just
what age she will marry?
Huh?
At what age she will marry?
Right. Exactly. So this is interpellation according to Althusser. And Althusser argues that ideology functions to naturalize this. ये तो नेचुरली है ना, लड़कियों को ऐसे ही कपड़े पहने होते हैं, ऐसे ही बिहेव करना होता है, ऐसे. So it naturalizes this artificial system, which is unequal and exploitative, right? So the function of ideology, according to Althusser, is to naturalize hierarchies, right? It's hegemonic in that sense. So culture is also seen from those points of view, right? Another influence on culture studies comes from a person called Michel Foucault, whom we discussed, who revises the understanding of power and knowledge, right? Power was thought of as something that comes from top to bottom. यानी जो राजा है या प्राइम मिनिस्टर है या पुलिस है, वो ऊपर से नीचे आती है पावर. ऐसा ट्रेडिशनल मार्क्सिस्ट अंडरस्टैंडिंग था. Foucault uses Nietzschean understanding of power, saying that everybody in the world is driven by will to power over someone else or your own self. So power comes from bottom to up, right? And power was thought as negative by the traditional Marxist thinkers, that or Freudian thinkers. They would say power is something that tells you not to have sex with A, B, C, D. That is what power is. But Foucault says power is productive, again following Nietzsche, that it produces new forms of discourses and models and ideas. It is not a negative thing, right? It produces new forms, like it produces new hairstyle. It produces new fashion. It is not negative, it's a productive thing. So power does not work from top to down, but it works from bottom to up it is not negative, but it is productive, right? And the third thing that he emphasizes that uh, uh, power is deeply connected to knowledge. You cannot separate knowledge from power. That when you want to have knowledge on about India, when the Easterners want, the Westerners, the colonizers wanted to study India, they are actually creating India as an object to be studied. Just like madness was a category that became a subject for analysis. You study madness. So madness and mad person becomes an object of your study. So India became a subject and the object of research. But this object of research is a kind of power relation. You want to control that object, right? You want to learn how it works so that you can control and contain it. And he goes on to say that power does not want to kill resistance. And this is a radical thought that Foucault proposes. Power wants resistance. यानी पावरफुल जो होता है या पावर होती है वो चाहती है कि आप उसका अपोज करो, आप उसके खिलाफ बोलो, तो ही वो दिखा सकेगा कि मैं पावरफुल हूं. This is a new understanding of power, right? It wants you to oppose it so that it can show its power. Power can be demonstrated. So it wants resistance, it wants opposition. And this is a very new understanding of power that Foucault introduced, right? And one of the ideas that Foucault promoted is the idea of discourse. Discourse is when knowledge and power go together. You cannot separate knowledge from power, right? For example, knowledge about sexuality that emerges in 19th century cannot be separated from the desire to control sexuality, contain it, put it in a safe place, take it out of inconvenient locations, right? So power studies, produces knowledge about sexuality, and in the process produces sexuality. And one category that emerged in 19th century was homosexual, according to Foucault. The homosexual activities existed, but the social category of homosexual was invented in 19th century to fix a person in a particular slot, to regulate and contain that person. Right? So a classificatory grid is constructed, which is imposed on the society by the power. So that is how power works, right? So Freud starts studying sexuality, and according to Foucault, that is a symptom of society which wants to control sexuality. So Foucault would say literature is a discourse. Right? It is not an aesthetic object. It's a discourse which produces knowledge of certain kinds. And by producing that knowledge, produces those objects of certain kind. Does that make any sense? Any doubts about what I have said till now?
At last, you said about this, the object and that thing that I didn't understand. Before that, I understand everything.
Yeah.
Last
Very
line.
good. So what happens is when you produce a discourse around a particular thing, for example, Orient, right? When you produce knowledge about Orient, by Orientalists who are the Western scholars who are studying India or China, when they study and produce knowledge about India, they are producing a particular perception of India. Does that make any sense? And that is what I think even Manjari was, or somebody was indicating, that how Westerners see us, right? Was it Manjari who brought it up, or was it Shikha, I don't know.
Yes, I was talking about A.L. Basham and Vincent Arthur
Uh-huh.
Smith when they were
Right.
pointing
So
out to.
A.L. Basham, when he produces knowledge about India, he is producing a certain perception about what India is. Right. And this perception is the object. तो वेस्टर्नर को लगता है यही इंडिया है. Right. So after
Yes, sir.
9/11, some of the Americans started beating Sikhs, Sardar, because they thought because everybody with a beard is a Muslim who comes from the east. So this perception is the object, or perception is created by that discourse, and this perception is fixated in people's mind as the truth and reality. Right. So this is how discourse produces truth. Discourse is supposed to be a truth claim that comes with it. ये अमेरिकन तो ऐसे ही है कि वो बहुत मटीरियलिस्ट लोग हैं. Right. That is also a discourse, right, which produces truth about Americans. Or Muslims are like this. That is also a discourse which produces truth about Muslims. Now, is this truth real? Maybe or maybe not. But this is a perception that discourse produces. WhatsApp produces discourses, right, which shape people's perception, and that is accepted as truth by people. Now, Foucault would point out this is political. This is how you produce objects of discourse. So, no, that's fine, Shikha. You can listen to the entire discussion on the recording later on, right? No issues. So
Sure,
what
I'm so
Foucault
sorry
is
for having.
saying, yeah, is that discourse is political always. Knowledge and power go together. So when Orientalists like, say for example, William Jones writes about India, he's producing a knowledge which shapes the perception of India, which is convenient for the colonizers. And that is what Edward Said points out. This is that the point that I'm telling, example that I'm giving is Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, right? So Orientalism produced India or China or Iran by creating a certain stereotypical representation which made it convenient for colonizers to colonize them. Now, they may not have done it deliberately. जैसे ग्रियरसन नाम का अंग्रेज था, he went on the donkey, collected all the information about languages on the subcontinent. That was phenomenal. It is called a linguistic survey of India. Right now, this looks as a noble activity, but this whole knowledge about language can equip the British government to control Indian politics. Yes, no? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yeah?
Yes, sir.
So Orientalism is a good example of discourse. So one of the schools of studying literature is deeply influenced by this Foucauldian notion of discourse, right? And that school is called New Historicism. It's an American school which largely studies Renaissance England. Renaissance यानी वो Elizabethan England. वो specialists हैं, and some of the important names are Stephen Greenblatt, Louise Montrose, and others. Right? Stephen Greenblatt is one of the pioneers of New Historicism. So, what do you mean by New Historicism? Is the contrast between Old Historicism and New Historicism. Old Historicism ये कहता था कि Shakespeare is a byproduct of his times. Elizabethan period का byproduct है वो. And his literature reflects Elizabethan social reality, cultural reality. This is what the old historicist method say. right? Second thing that old historicists would insist that history is somehow the truth about a particular period, right? So जो कुछ आप जानते हो एलिजाबेथन एज के बारे में हिस्ट्री बुक्स में से वो सच है, right? That is the second key assumption of old historicism, right? And a very famous book is by Tilliard called Elizabethan World Picture, 1940 या 30 में आई थी, जिसमें वो बताता है कि शेक्सपियर के प्लेस में या उस मार्लो में एक एलिजाबेथन वर्ल्ड व्यू दिखता है, दुनिया को दिखने का एलिजाबेथन नजरिया उसमें दिखता है. And he's arguing as if almost all Elizabethans would have the same worldview, right? So he is taking the worldview as a monolith or homogeneous world. सब लोग उस टाइम में जो जिंदा थे उनके सबके दुनिया को देखने का नजरिया एक ही था, right? So this is an example of old historicism.
Sir, can you relate old historicism with our education system?
Yeah, it follows that because our education system says this is the truth,
Yeah.
right? And it says that this is a reflection of that period, right? And it says that everybody in that period have a similar worldview. So you can say that our education policy very often follows
Old
historicist ideas. Very good, very good. And historicism itself was a byproduct of a bourgeois worldview and values, of rationalist historiography, especially found in Hegel. Right? Hegel said that history is driven by the logic of dialectic, whose ultimate end is absolute freedom and absolute rationality. Right? That is the Hegelian model of history. And it's a linear one. पहले बहुत कम फ्रीडम था, आज मैक्सिमम फ्रीडम है हमारे पास, कल उससे ज्यादा होगा. That's a linear understanding. So old historicists, as I think Tatsam was talking about earlier, has a linear model of history, right? So how is new historicism different from this? New historicism started by people like Stephen Greenblatt, influenced by two important thinkers associated with postmodernism. One is Michel Foucault and second is Hayden White. Foucault के बारे में तो हमने देखा. Hayden White is a philosopher of history who says that writing history, that is historiography, इतिहास लेखन पद्धति को historiography कहते हैं. Historiography also follows the same device that a novelist or a short story writer follows. Right? It has a plot, it has characters, it has certain tropes and metaphors, and it characterizes and so on. Basically, he is saying history is also a narrative. Right? History, writing and history is not to be taken as absolute truth, representation of truth, but history itself resembles fiction. So all historiography is a narrative, a story, almost fictional story. That is what Hayden White said. So particular history that was given to us by the colonizers, that there was a golden Vedic age, बाद में Muslim rulers आए, and that was the dark age, और फिर हम लोग आए और आपको बचा लिया. और इसीलिए हमको यहाँ पे राज करने का अधिकार है. That is the history model given by colonizers, especially John Stuart Mill. They divide history in the Hindu period, Muslim period, and the great British period. The times of freedom and justice and order. So it was meant to, one, divide Hindu and Muslims, and secondly, to justify colonial rule. Right? So this is the narrative that was sold to Indians by the Britishers, and we accepted that narrative as truth. It became a hegemonic narrative, right? Hayden White would say that this is also a narrative. What you call history is also a narrative, a fictional narrative. Does that make any sense? Because it uses the same devices as a novelist uses or a short story writer uses. तो उसमें beginning, middle and end होता है. Beginning क्या है तो वैदिक गोल्डन पीरियड है. मिडिल में क्या होता है तो इस्लामिक रूलर्स है. और एंड में क्या होता है अंग्रेज आके हम सबको छुड़वा लेते हैं. वो हमारे सेवियर है. Right? And India is a damsel in distress in which white man rescues her. Right? Now this has a linearity. It has a trope. And it has its own agenda, right? So Hayden White would say history writing is also a political act, and it does not really reveal truth, which means history is also textual. Does that mean anything to you? History is a textual practice. That means it involves textual. History is a textual practice, a narrative. Yeah, Tatsam.
So suppose like if a person believes in Mahabharata, like if he used to say that Mahabharata is true, it was happened. We can't say it's a like it's a epic, not like it's true. So then can we say that person is following all historicism?
Yes. Yes, that is the old historical model. ये सचमुच हुआ था यार. कृष्ण 112 साल की उम्र में रथ लेके जाता है और बीच में खड़ा रह के भगवत गीता जो 18 अध्याय में चलती है वो कहता है अर्जुन को. तब तक दुर्योधन और वो सब बैठ के मक्खियां मारते हैं. राइट? 18 अध्याय. तब तक ये लोग सामने वाले क्या करते थे यार, मुझे यही हमेशा समझ में आती है. Right?
So, but yeah,
Yeah.
but so if you look at it technically or at its face value, isn't it
Pardon?
said that it is, yeah, if we look at it on its face value, that was it or did it actually happen, and all of those evidences that they kind of try to trace. And if you look at it, if you kind of put it in the timeline, a lot of historians say that it really did not happen. It really did not happen looking at the evidences, but there must have been some things because one theory that I read stated that there was a tribe called the Puru and the Bharatas who came with the Aryans. So when they were fighting a war with the Dasyus, they emerged as Kurus, and so these Kurus were actually there. And during the that is what they say. And during the Gupta period, all of that started getting compiled because they were moving towards Bhagavatism as a form of religion and moving away from probably Buddhism and Jainism, which were the new ones. And during that period, they wanted to fabricate discourses which would make Hinduism prosper, and for that they wanted people to relate to it. So in order to get that relation, they would bring up stories of high moral value and kind of bring characters like Ram and all of those things. And that is the reason Ramayana came later, because they wanted them to behave like ideal human beings. And Mahabharata came first because they wanted to show what was the real dharma. And that's how a lot of people say. So probably did it happen is,
For example, if somebody asks you what is the period of composition of Mahabharata, then the historical evidence say anything between 500 BC and 500 AD. 1000 साल का पीरियड है जहाँ पे महाभारत keeps on developing as a narrative, right? And there are interpolations. People have added their own stuff, and we don't know. So if you look at it as history, right? Then there are things which may have some historical background. Dwarka milti hai, right? But it does not mean that Krishna is God. These are two different things. द्वारका का होना और वहां पे कृष्ण होना, कृष्ण नाम का राजा होना और वो भगवान होना, ये दो अलग चीजें हैं. Is it the one and the same thing? a historical figure called Krishna existed. Correct. But Krishna is God is another narrative. It's not one narrative. You say just because he existed historically, he is God. That logic is problematic. It does not have a logic. So what I am saying is that history itself is a construct, and Mahabharata was a historical narrative of that time, which constructed a narrative of past, right? Very similar to what people do today, just like what Britishers do today, right? Did today, that they created a narrative of past. But these narratives are fictional stories, or they are narratives. They do not always correspond. They do not give you the ultimate truth of that period. That is what Hayden White is telling you, right? So Mahabharata belongs to Itihas Purana tradition of historiography, जो पहले थी भारत में. इतिहास लेखन की परंपरा है वो महाभारत, right? रामायण. But Hayden White कहता है modern history is also like that. It's a narrative. That's the point. I hope you get what I'm trying to tell you. All historiographical practices are narrative practices, and hence they don't tell you the absolute truth. They can't tell you. And they involve invariably fictional elements. यानी आज जो इतिहास लिखने बैठेगा वो भी कुछ फिक्शन है तो ऐड करेगा ही, और वो एब्सोल्यूट ट्रूथ तो नहीं देगा. That is what Hayden White is saying. Any questions about Hayden White's theory of history?
So Hayden says that
Hayden
history
White,
is also.
yeah.
Hayden White says that history is also a political way. So, like, say, in what sense? Like,
जैसे अंग्रेजों का एग्जाम्पल मैंने दिया कि उन्होंने ये एक हिस्ट्री दी कि पहले सुवर्ण युग था, बाद में मुसलमान आए और सब बार्बरिज्म आया, ऑल बैड थिंग्स हैपेंड, और बाद में अंग्रेज आए जिन्होंने इसमें से हमको छुड़ाया. So that is the history model of history given by James Mills and others, who never put his step in India. वो इंडिया कभी आया ही नहीं था, फिर भी उसने इंडिया की हिस्ट्री लिख डाली, right? And this narrative is a narrative. Yes, वो absolute truth नहीं है. I hope you get that.
understood.
And is convenient because it justifies British rule, and it helps British to divide and rule Indians. It's a very convenient story. अब ये स्टोरी हिस्ट्री के तौर पे आती है, हिस्ट्री का बेस पहन के आती है. दैट इज व्हाट हेडन वाइट इज सेइंग, क्योंकि उसे सत्य माना जाता है. Am I being clear?
Yes, sir.
And that's why it's a discourse, right? It's a colonial discourse. Colonial historiography was a colonial discourse in Foucauldian sense. It had a political agenda. And the political agenda was not just to justify British rule, but also to divide the population on communal lines. So history has political agenda to it. Does that make it clear? कैसे इतिहास के पीछे राजनीति होती है?
Understood, sir. Understood.
Right? So these ideas, Hayden White and Foucault's ideas, are the cornerstone of new historicism. Anything that you have to say, anyone, before we stop? We'll discuss it in some detail tomorrow, right? Because we are run out of time. You have a class just now? 1 बजे का?
Yes, sir. We have class from 1:10. I have class from 1:10.
Okay, so we'll stop. But anything that you have to say, anyone? Shikha, Manjari, Amatullah, Tatsam?
So I'll listen to the recording and get back to you.
Yeah.
Like
Okay.
after what you're watching.
Okay. What about Amatullah and Manjari?
Sir, I just had one question that when we were talking about metafiction, and there's also this thing called magical
Meta,
realism.
huh.
Magical realism. So, what is the difference between both?
Metafiction is a narrative strategy which involves talking about oneself. जैसे मैं नॉवेल लिख रहा हूं तो मैं उस लेखन की पद्धति के बारे में बात कर रहा हूं. You enter it as an author, right? You talk about writing the novel in the novel. That is metafiction. Fiction about fiction itself is called metafiction. Magic realism are the tropes, devices that I discussed in the writings of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? So these are two different techniques. When Milan Kundera enters his novel as a character, it is called metafiction. While Marquez में जो खून बहता है और वो पूरे गांव के एंड तक जाता है उसके माँ के घर, that is called magic realism. And magic realism was a device used by Latin American writers in post-colonial, post-modern context. Or this brings us to Tatsam's question whether postmodernism and post-colonialism are related. Then in magic realism of Marquez or Salman Rushdie, or you find these things coming together. It is both post-colonial and post-modern. And the device is magic realism. यानी fantasy और reality के बीच में कोई it is seamless movement, right? And the ideology behind that is that Latin Americans argued that the colonizers had imposed rationality, but the authentic Latin American कहानियां थी वो magical और real दोनों को combine करती थी. So we reject this realist model which is colonial, right? And we go back to our own roots when we go back to folklore and myth, right? And thus magic realism is a part of post-colonial because it tries to counter the colonial poetics of novel which were realistic. Does that help you to understand it better?
Yes, sir. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
So I just want to clarify one thing. Like in the 6th edition of this A Glossary of Literary Terms, they have given new historicism. So like
मगर फिर भी 11th ले लो ना क्योंकि
ठीक है
उसमें
सर.
काफी नए चीजें ऐड की है उसने.
Okay, no worries. No worries. Okay.
ये थोड़ा पुराना हो गया है.
Like it was when my father was in a master's.
So now buy it for yourself.
Yes, sir.
All of you should actually buy this glossary of literary terms because हर एक जो आइडिया हमने डिस्कस की ना इसमें है, राइट? तो आपको पढ़ने में आसानी रहेगी. आसान लैंग्वेज में कहा है. This is the 11th edition that you should go in for.
Yes, sir.
Right. So we stop for today.
Hmm.
Right. So